These clamps are actually something new that they've done now. It's your typical like V-band clamp versus their other clamp was like a machined clamp. So just like the turbo, we have the rotation we can set. We're gonna do the same thing with the wastegates, so we can rotate them like this. We're gonna get these guys on. We're gonna set this up for twin port. I used a little bit of red Loctite on the threads. I have seen these guys work themselves loose in the past. They use crush washers on either end. It's just like a traditional banjo bolt. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna have our hoses go in this direction. And so everything's accessible from the top. So we'll run a hose, and our hose barbs will be the back center of the intake manifold. So this will keep it nice and clean, away from the heat, away from the bell housing. So if you ever have to do a clutch replacement, you don't need to mess with this. So on these kits, all you have to do is remove the pipe that comes off the wastegate to the downpipe. The actual wastegates can stay in along with the downpipe, but you're just going to be removing the recirc / dump pipe off the wastegate. If you're going to do a single port, you would still put these hose barb fittings in, and you'd probably just point them downwards so no dirt gets in there. But since we're going to use them, again, we're going to point upwards towards the top center of the engine, and our side ports will basically face inwards towards the center of the engine. Okay guys, we're going to plumb our wastegates. We'll start with our side ports. And as I mentioned previously, we're going to basically, for easy, quick access, especially if you need to troubleshoot, we're going to have the hoses kind of come up to the back of the intake manifold, and then we'll have our T right in the center. So in case we need to ever do any diagnosing, we know we can get to it very easily. I've seen a couple of cars come in with the T's down here or over here, and it's a total nightmare when you're trying to fix somebody's issue when they didn't plumb something correctly. We also want to try and keep all these hoses equal. So that's why we like to do it at the very center to have our T. It's not super critical, but I like to do that. Makes me feel better that the length of hose is the same. And once we have our hoses connected, we'll go ahead and tighten up the banjo bolts. And then we'll make sure to use zip ties or clamps to keep the hoses from coming off. Zip tied to each other to get a nice clean look as well. We'll do that next. All right, you can see we have a nice little clean run up to the back of the engine. We have our T's right in the center, pretty much equal length from left to right. And then we're gonna put our zip ties. This will help prevent the hoses from popping off the hose barbs. And again, this is twin port configuration, okay? Keep note of that. This is the way I usually like to do it on this kit. Able to make a little bit more boost more easily, especially if you've got like a built engine where you can run higher boost than you would on a stock engine, and you're gonna be using a light spring. So like in my Z, I have the default springs that come with this kit, which is roughly 6-7 pounds of boost. And I'm able to make 25-26 pounds of boost easily without maxing out the duty cycle on the boost controller. It's the benefit of doing a twin port configuration. You can have a lower base spring pressure, but still make a decent amount of boost up top. All right, guys, wastegates are in. Next piece of the puzzle are these downpipes. Really beautiful little setup from FI with the kit. These cone down to 2.5, so you've got a nice little tapered cone right at the end, so it'll match up to any 2.5-inch catback. This car is going to be running a 2.5-inch fast intentions catback on it. And pay attention to the way the wastegate gases go back into the downpipe. So you don't have any 90-degree going back in, disrupting the flow of the exhaust gases. This is sometimes where people say, oh, it's going to make more power if we just have it vented to atmosphere. Well, it can if you introduce it back at a 90-degree angle, like perpendicular. But you can see here, again, a real attention to detail with this kit. Down to here, it's going to go with the exhaust gases and out through the catback. So really, really nice implementation. You can see we have a nice little bellow so that this stuff can all move. So this will come out of our wastegate outlet and into the inlet of our downpipe. Let's get these bad boys installed. right, guys, we've got our V-band on and downpipe, and again, we're gonna leave the V-band loose so we can rotate it. We have a fixture, a little jig that we've got to make sure we have everything aligned properly. And then we'll go ahead and start tightening things down from the turbine housing on the inlet side. We'll get our wastegate all set up, tighten the wastegate to exhaust manifold. Then we'll do our downpipe, and then we'll finalize the wastegate outlet to our downpipe. We're gonna go ahead and install our passenger side. We've got our wastegate clock pretty close. So the important thing is obviously when dealing with V-bands, he's gotta be perfectly flat. So we'll start by getting our clamp on there, which is a little tough doing this without any help. All right, so here we go. Again, this is all gonna be loose, and we're not gonna use a gasket. We're just gonna use some silicone, some RTV, either copper or red. Works perfect for exhaust. So we're gonna use that, and that's why we have a little bit of a bellow here, so for that movement, so we can get it just right. So we'll get the silicone in, we'll get our jig installed, do the same thing on the left-hand side, and then we'll start to tighten everything down. Coming together. We've got this left-hand side in. Before we get too crazy, we're gonna go ahead and just silicone this. Here's that jig. So we have this little jig set up so we can kind of get this all squared up. For those of you that don't have the luxury of doing this install with the jig, I will use a straight edge and line myself up with the cross member in certain sections. Get them equal from left to right. This can still be off if you don't get it just right. Bolts and nuts, we're just gonna put them in finger tight. Again, one of the nice things about a V-band is that you don't need to worry about any gaskets whatsoever. So it's all machine surfaces that sit super flat. That's the key, is they need to sit super flat. Otherwise, if it's not installed correctly or fabricated correctly, you're gonna have an exhaust leak. If you're using inferior V-band parts, you're gonna have leaks. So it all comes down to using quality stuff, quality install, quality fabrication. It all makes a difference in the end. This is sitting nice and flat, pretty equal. And what we're gonna look for is basically where we are in relation to this cross member hole from left to right. So we'll get our straight edge, and once we get it pretty equal, we'll go ahead and start tightening things up. 2 exhaust manifolds, V-band. You don't need to go stupid tight on this stuff. Again, I like to use anti-seize on the threads of all this stuff, and on the inside of the flange as well, where the clamp is gonna rest on the flange. Easier to get the rotation without it binding. Our downpipe or turbine outlet, and then we'll finish it up with our 2-bolt flange for the wastegate exit. Everything's tightened up. We'll give the downpipes a little bit of cleaning with some window cleaner, and we'll put some new O2 sensors on this bad boy. Wideband sensors, front and rear. That way we're not compromising anything when we go to tune this thing. We know the sensors are gonna be working correctly. We're not gonna be fighting ourselves. It's always good. You're starting with a project this big. Sensors are old, original. Do yourself a favor, spend the extra money, replace them, do it right. Way less headaches at the end for you and your tuner. Get a nice, beautiful final view of that billet compressor wheel. Unfortunately, we got to put our intake tube and air filter on, so say bye. So pretty. Isn't she lovely? We're going to cover it up, get one final shot of it. Looks so badass with that manifold, the compressor wheel, that compressor housing, and in the background, you have that tile turbine housing too, so it all just looks so bitchin' cool. But we'll get our coupler on, our intake tube on, and we'll get this bad boy back in its home. All right, we're gonna get our air filters. These are reusable, washable, kind of like the K&Ns and similar other brands out there. These are really nice. Make sure our AFE logo is facing correctly and our hose clamp is pointed down. For cleaning or replacing, we can get to it easily just to get to that clamp. All right, make sure you don't put the air filters on too far in front of the fender liner. We're going to be putting on our catch can on this setup, so we're not going to be using the breather system. So we're going to plug these ports. These ports would normally go to the large breather ports on the valve cover. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to cap this port, we'll cap this, we'll remove the PCV valve, put our CJM fitting, and run these ports to our open catch can setup. PCV's gone, get our CJM fitting in there. This is gonna provide better breathability for the engine. Looks can be deceiving sometimes, these valve covers. They have a restrictor in them, and this opening isn't as big as it is by the time it gets into here. So this is gonna do a much better job of allowing the crankcase blow-by pressures to come out of there. All right, guys, before we get this motor back in the chassis, we're gonna go ahead and get our regulator installed, hook up our return line that used to be the feed line. We'll do all this now. It's just gonna be way easier to do it now instead of fighting with space with the engine being in here. So we've got our Aeromotive fuel pressure regulator mounted, we've got our fuel pressure gauge in there, and we're ready to do our return hose. So we're gonna work on that next.